Hi, I'm Paul Counelis. I'm an author, and today I'm going to read to you from one of my books. But first, I want to tell you just a little bit about myself. I write fiction, nonfiction. A lot of it's horror. Not all of it, though. Something We Could Never Be. Highly recommended love story. And also, I write for magazines, websites, all different kinds of stuff. Mostly horror and Halloween related because I love horror and I love Halloween. Halloween Machine is my, passion project, labor of love. This is the greatest horror movie ever made, which is a collection of stories, well, not stories, essays, making a case for 10 different movies as the greatest horror movie ever made. I also have essays on Monster Kids, which is basically what movies got you into being a fan of monsters and horror and Halloween as a kid. Anyway, I have a bunch of stuff if you want to check out more of my stuff on Facebook. I have a page there. My last name is Counelis, which will be on the video. Obviously, I've always wanted to do this on the video down there. And for now, I'd like you to enjoy the epic tale of one Bob Zombie. This artwork is done by Randy Dunkley, super talented artist and guitar player. And actually, I saw a pretty great set of lyrics or a poem that he wrote the other day. My dad was cast in the short film that we started to make as Herbert Pleasance or Hébert Plaisance. And he took the role very seriously. He developed a Cajun accent for it. So, I'm not going to try to imitate what he had for it in the reading, but I just wanted to give him a shout out. Without further ado, please enjoy Bob Zombie, A Love Story. The chicken. That frickin' chicken. Bob Hinojosa Jr. sat on a toilet at Baba's Chicken Shake restaurant, dreading his return to his shift. His stomach hurt, and the smell of that chicken was wafting through the thick air even now, the smell of his own fresh waste notwithstanding. Bob shook his head and pulled up his tan dockers, which were about 2 sizes too large for him. He tucked in his fugly, puke-poo green chicken store shirt. Blaine had called it that in jest earlier in the day, and sighed as he flushed. As he watched his feces fade into sewer heaven, he wondered if his dreams and hopes were suffering that same fate, albeit infinitely more slowly. His dreams of making it as a rapper seemed as unlikely to come true as hanging with William Shatner at a rave. Bob had a habit of being too critical on himself. He paused at the mirror, studying the lines on his pale face, wondering how many of them were new. With his short brownish red hair cropped close to his scalp, he reminded himself more of a hip-hop howdy-doody than the rhyme god he yearned to be. In school, he had to deal with taunts due to his white skin and Hispanic last name. They had called him White Perez, Caucasian Rodriguez, things like that. Brought back to reality by a loud bang on the door and the curse-infested prodding of an impatient night shift manager, Bob combed his hair, which was probably too short to comb, and turned quickly to hurry back to Hell's Kitchen. Blaine had come up with that gym as well. He didn't notice the small trail of urine directly on the floor in front of him. When the doorbell rang, no one heard it. That's because the fellas were busy yelling and screaming out yo mama jokes at the top of their lungs, frantically trying to top one another in a battle of the mostly regurgitated. Blaine was standing on a table. King Kong ain't got nothing on yo mama! His brown, yellow hair whipped around his face like an uneasy frame. He smiled broadly as the rest of them laughed. He was Bob's best friend, standing up for him regardless of Bob's guilt or the accuracy of the attack. Chris was laughing so hard it seemed as if he were almost insane. Maybe he was. He had curly light brown hair near shoulder length and an abundance of freckles peppered across his nose and cheeks. That's so stupid. I have no idea why I'm laughing. Jesse looked embarrassed, a shroud of dark pink covering his boyish face. He pointed at Jason, rolling with unbridled laughter in the corner of the room. What is Jason laughing at? Looking like the lost Ramon. Dorky Ramon. Jess was bald with a thick mustache that he dyed as black as he could, purposely, to be funny. Jason kind of did look like one of the Ramones. Hey, at least I don't look like a mix of Harry Potter and Mr. Cotter. Chris fell on the floor again. He was crying now. Ah, who the heck is Mr. Cotter? The doorbell rang again. This time they heard it. Except Jason, who yelled obnoxiously, "Your mom's cooking is so bad, the flies pitched in to get the screen door fixed." Scattered chuckles tailed off as Blaine looked out the window. "It's the police," Blaine screeched quietly. Jesse went to answer the door. The first officer, Drinkwine, took off his hat. Jesse had seen enough movies to know that the next words from the policeman's lips weren't going to be flowers and candy. "Is this the residence of Bob Hinojosa?" Yes. The officer sighed. His resemblance to pro wrestler Bill Goldberg notwithstanding, his eyes looked compassionate as he spoke the inevitable. "I'm sorry. Bob is dead." Blaine screamed at the top of his lungs, empowered by the passion of mourning. "No!" The funeral was beautiful. Rappers and rockers from around the city came to pay respects and comfort the young group. Bob was buried with his microphone, having always been enamored with the idea of Bela Lugosi spending the afterlife in his Dracula cape. Blaine didn't go. He couldn't. Hours after the funeral, he still lay motionless in his room, his mind racing around the week's events, refusing to settle, even for a moment. After what seemed like a lifetime of silence, he screamed, what many who heard it would later recall as the most blood-curdling, hair-raising shriek they'd ever heard from another human being. Then he lay motionless again, not crying, not convulsing with anger and sadness, perfectly and wholly still. Sunset Hill Cemetery was extremely quiet. There was nary a sound in the air, and the freshly covered grave of Bob Hinojosa Jr. stood out in the autumn moonlight amongst the more weathered and less prominent plots nearby. Had anyone been watching in the graveyard at the late hour, something else would have caught their attention. Had anyone been watching and listening, they would have seen a faint movement above ground and heard a rustling neath the earth of Bob Hinojosa Jr.'s memorial. Had anyone been watching, they would have been very startled to see the hand of Bob Hinojosa Jr. strike out from the ground it had been buried in. With the quietest of breaths, Bob pulled himself up from his new resting place, staggered to his feet, and began the unlikely task of walking. Resembling a newborn calf crossed with the character Bub from the film Day of the Dead, the newly revived undead rapper began the trek back to his home. Instinctively, it would seem, driven by a ringing in his ears, which, had he been able to, Bob would have recognized as the cry of his earthly best friend, Blaine. At exactly 2:37 a.m. at the residence of Blaine Diffenderfer and friends, there was a very loud yet sluggish knock on the front door. Chris awoke. He gathered himself into his Scooby-Doo pajamas. "Holy crap, calm down, I'm coming," Chris hollered. He opened the door. To his surprise, there stood his dead friend Bob. Looking a bit worse for wear, in the flesh, kind of, with a slightly goofy smile upon his mildly askew face. Chris froze. Then, he screamed what many who heard it would later recall as the second most blood-curdling, hair-raising shriek they'd ever heard from another human being. At precisely 2:39 a.m. on October 31st, the rest of the boys were awake and running into the living room. One by one, they saw Bob and reacted loudly with various forms of the phrase, "What the?" Jesse tried to hug him. Bob embraced him warmly, dumb smile ever present. But when he leaned in a little to take a nibble on Jesse's left ear, it was decided that they should refrain from further such greetings until they could assess the situation a bit more. Or, as Chris put it slightly more bluntly, "Dude, he's a freaking zombie. Do not touch him." It appeared that whatever a zombie is, Bob was indeed a new member of that community. Still, zombie or no, he was a friend, and Blaine was so overjoyed to see him that the small fact that his lifelong friend had somehow crawled out from his own grave was but a footnote to their reunion. As days went by, Bob and his friends began adjusting, as it were, to the strange new situation. They had discovered that Bob's desire for flesh could be placated by raw hamburger, or sometimes even just a glazed donut with red sprinkles. Still, there were times when Bob would forget and would absentmindedly begin to gnaw on a buddy's shoulder. For these regrettable moments, the guys had zombie fighting weapons such as a fly swatter, a rolled newspaper, a litter box scooper. They would smack him derisively, and he would look hurt for a moment, but soon return to the ever-present silly smile countenance. Other activities presented new challenges. In order to integrate Bob back into everyday life, the fellows accompanied him to the bar to play with his rap group. On stage, it was instantly clear that whatever rapping skill Bob had possessed in life had been drastically reduced as a member of the undead. The audience would fidget uncomfortably, some feigning amusement as Bob labored to connect syllables and sounds. Still, the scattered applause seemed to be enough to appease him. So every Thursday night, he continued his new career as the Earth's only living dead rapper. Bob also took part in pickup football games with his buddies. Blaine insisted they let him play, despite Jason's vehement feeling that it was a terrible idea. Jason's fears were realized when, during a particularly rough game, Bob was tackled and landed right in the middle of a bush. Everyone had cringed when he fell. Some even relieved themselves of their respective lunch when they looked back at him. Protruding from his chest was a large, strong branch. Still, he smiled that ridiculous smile back at them. Haybear Pleasance had been hunting zombies for the last 2 years. During that time period, he had caught exactly 0. Despite his lack of productivity, he grew only more intense with his efforts. He had seen zombies before, sure. Houses full of them. He had given chase to them, had run from them, and had even called some on the phone, which they answered reflexively with groans and strange sounds. Haybear hadn't shaved in at least a year. Just because the rest of the world wasn't aware of the undead walking amongst them didn't mean he was going to take a day off from his resolve, not even to attend to personal hygiene. One fateful Thursday evening, as Bob and Jesse prepared to drive to the bar for Bob's weekly jam night escapades, Jesse would be driving, Blaine entered the house with a disturbed look on his face. "What's the deal?" asked Jesse, alarmed. "Rannig Blumph," asked Bob, with a frivolous grin. Blaine answered, "I don't know. I just have a bad feeling. Like we shouldn't go tonight." "Women's intuition," opined Chris. "Very funny," Blaney answered. "I'm serious. I feel like something bad might happen tonight." That was all Jason needed to hear. "Then we shouldn't go," he offered. Chris was having none of it. "There are 5 of us, and one of us is a freaking zombie. I think we'll be okay." "I'm worried about Bob." "I won't. I can't lose him again," Blaine responded. "Look," started Chris. "If we get there and the vibe's still bad, we'll leave." Everyone agreed, and the fateful night began to unfold. As these things go, and as fate would have it, Haybear Pleasance was stopping by the local bar for a drink at approximately the exact moment that Bob was taking the stage. He paused in his truck, with his hand on his keys, upon hearing the strains of the funky beat inside the bar. "I hate rap." Haybear sighed, then decided to go in anyway. At the bar, Haybear seated himself facing away from the stage. He sipped his drink, stopping here and again to grit his teeth at the sounds emanating from the stage. As Bob began his 12-bar section of the rap song, Haybear couldn't help but to look and see what was making that awful noise. There's a moment in many fine films, and terrible films, in which the camera zooms in on a character's sudden contemplation of realization. Had this been a movie, this would have been one of those moments, and Haybear's face would have been frozen on celluloid with a jaw-dropping stare at what he was seeing. His mouth still full of crumbs, he slowly and quietly formed the word. Zombie, he managed. He got a little louder this time. The guy next to him heard him. "Zombie." Haybear jumped to his feet, threw back his coat, grabbed the gun from his belt, and charged the stage. "Zombie!" "Oh no," yelled Jesse. "Stop him!" "No!" hollered Blaine. The music stopped. Bob looked at his friends, now knocking over tables to defend him from the crazed Haybear. "Rufflegum," Bob said with a witless smirk. Haybear roared, "Out of the way! That guy is a zombie!" Most of the patrons ran from the bar screaming, except for Bob's friends, who made a human wall around him, and the brave doorman, who was trying to reason with the zombie hunter. "He's not a zombie, sir. He's a rapper. Granted, he isn't very good, but that's no reason to shoot him." Haybear wouldn't be persuaded. "Zombie," he said. "He has to die." Again. Look, said the doorman. Even if he is a zombie, he isn't hurting anyone. Yeah, you friggin' jerk, screamed Chris. Bob smiled gaily. The man appeared to be slightly calmer for a moment as he studied Bob. Something in the innocent look of his drooping yellow zombie eyes seemed to reach him. But zombies, they're bad. Jesse interjected. Mister? Bob isn't bad. He's a tortured and unfortunate soul, but he doesn't hurt anyone. We've trained him. He doesn't want to eat flesh anymore. The doorman's eyes widened at those words. Jesse continued. He doesn't really even know what he's doing. He has some awareness, but I think he's just acting on instinct. Aber lowered the gun. Well, I'll need to study him. Study him, yelled Jason. You should be lucky we don't call the cops on you. Blaine stepped directly in front of Aber. No, it's okay, he said, motioning toward Jason. We'll let you watch him for a couple days. After that, though, you gotta leave him alone. Let him get on with life. Aber Pleasance began to like Bob Hinojosa Jr., the zombie with the spirited smile. He watched from the couch as the young men played charades. The only problem with the game was Bob would always describe the same thing, one word, 2 syllables, and it was chicken. But it was fun to watch him try. And everyone laughed uproariously as Bob clucked and moved his arms back and forth at his side passionately. Weeks went by and Aber continued his visits. Aber was noticeably happier than before. He didn't stress about undead creatures any longer. Now he would walk into the house and say, Hello there, Bob. Bob even began to wave at him. It seemed as if Bob was growing, ever so slightly, with awareness. He seemed more able to understand what was going on around him. He even cried during rom-coms. One night, while Aber wasn't there, the boys were sitting around the living room talking. Suddenly, Bob let out a strange yell and pointed at the TV. Michael Jackson was dancing around a graveyard to the barely audible strains of his song, Thriller. What's wrong, Bob? Asked Blaine. Bob stood up and walked to the TV. He whimpered as he studied the emanating images. Tears rolled down his cheek. He hugged the screen. Chris laughed insanely. The next day, Blaine called Aber. He told them about the way Bob reacted to the music video. He noted that Bob had become more vulnerable and had even openly wept at a movie night screening of the film You've Got Mail. Said Aber. Maybe he's lonely. Blaine thought about that statement. That could be it. He sees us leave on dates, and he's been watching movies on the Lifetime channel. Well, listen, I have an idea, Aber said. Aber remembered recently seeing a female zombie under the bridge near the woods by his house. He had called to her as calmly as his newfound zombie sympathizing would allow, but she just turned and ran. He told Blaine about the reanimated woman. Wow. Are you sure she's a zombie? Blaine asked excitedly. Well, let's see. She moves slowly, drags her legs, doesn't say real words, and eats raw meat from the dumpster, Aber replied. Blaine was still a bit skeptical. Yeah, but a lot of people do weird things. That doesn't mean they're zombies. Well, and also, she's green, said Aber. The next day, Aber and the fellas drove Bob to the woods. They waited for hours at a picnic table outside the house, watching the bridge for signs of Bob's potential mate. After what seemed like hours and halfway through the third film in the Wishmaster film marathon, courtesy of Aber's rechargeable portable DVD player, she appeared. Bob noticed her first and said to Blaine, Frigidi! Blaine tried to quiet him. She looked back toward the group of boys and then started to run away. Blaine called after her. Don't be afraid. She stopped and looked again. Bob began walking toward her. This time, she didn't run. Dude, this is so crazy, said Chris. Jesse laughed, wiping away a tear. When Bob reached the girl, they studied each other for a moment. Bob smiled inanely. The girl returned the goofy gaze. Get a room, yelled Chris. Under the bridge at sunset, 2 zombies embraced and began walking back slowly toward the group. It took quite some time, because they were arm in arm and having a harder time moving at any kind of quick pace. This is the weirdest thing I've ever seen, said Jesse, but somehow it's beautiful. And it was. The undead couple reached the boys, who hugged Bob and introduced themselves to the girl. The sun was now nearly set, and the moon was illuminating the huge yard. Bob looked so happy. He turned to look at his new mate, then turned to Blaine and gave him a huge hug. Then, in a moment of inspired quickness, Bob grabbed Chris and bit his left pinky off. The rest of the boys screamed and ran, and Aber hurried to his truck to get his gun. The end. Thank you so much for listening. Here's a couple pages of the art. That was going to be a cartoon that had ran a couple times in the last issues of the Uncommon Sense magazine in Flint, Michigan that Randy and I did these cartoons for. As you see, it's an illustration of the football scene. And, Randy did a wonderful job there. Now, if you couldn't tell, some of these characters are based on real people, friends of mine. This is the real Bob. That's live on stage with Flint Ballers, Inc., which was a rap group that we had for a few years there. And here's me on stage with Bob. And Free Will with Bob. So, anyways, thank you for listening. And I hope you enjoyed it. And, thanks a lot.